I was 31 years old when I found her in my nets, and I'd been fishing commercially for almost a decade by then. The morning started the way most did: alarm at 4:30, instant coffee that tasted like diesel, and the walk down to the dock while the sky was still more black than blue. I ran a single boat operation out of Crescent Harbor, working the waters about 15 miles off the northern coast. The work was steady if you knew where to drop your lines, and I'd learned the patterns of the currents and the rocky shelves where fish congregated. That particular morning was a Tuesday in late September, and the forecast called for calm seas through the afternoon. I reached my usual spot just as the sun started breaking the horizon. The water was flat, almost glassy, with just enough movement to catch the early light in soft ripples. I'd set my nets the evening before in a configuration I'd used dozens of times: 3 lines anchored along the western edge of a shallow inlet, where the bottom dropped from 20 feet to nearly 60 in the span of 100 yards. The fish moved through that channel at dawn and dusk, and I could usually pull in enough cod and pollock to make the fuel costs worthwhile. The first 2 nets came up normal. I worked the winch slowly, letting the mechanical rhythm set the pace while I watched the water. You learn to read the weight and resistance through the equipment after enough years. Too heavy means you've snagged bottom or picked up debris. Too light means you've missed the run or something tore through the mesh. That morning, the first net held about 40 pounds of mixed catch. Nothing remarkable. The second had maybe 60 pounds, which was better than average for that spot during fall months. The third net felt wrong immediately. The winch strained more than it should have for the depth, but the resistance wasn't consistent like it would be with rocks or kelp. It pulsed slightly, and I remember thinking I'd probably caught a seal or a large skate. Both were common enough, and neither made me particularly happy since it meant damaged nets and lost time cutting them free. I slowed the winch and leaned over the gunwale to see what was coming up. The first thing I saw was the flash of pale skin against the dark green of the netting. My initial thought was that someone had lost fishing gear with a buoy attached, maybe something reflective catching the light. But as the net rose closer to the surface, I realized the pale color wasn't fabric or plastic. It was moving. Not thrashing exactly, but shifting in a controlled way that made my hands pause on the winch controls. I stopped the motor entirely and grabbed the gaff to pull the net alongside the boat. The water was clear enough that morning to see about 10 feet down, and what I saw made me stand completely still for what felt like several minutes but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. There was something tangled in the lower third of the net, roughly the size of a 6-year-old child, but it wasn't a child. The proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long relative to the torso, and where I expected to see legs kicking, there was something else. A tapering lower body that moved in the water like it belonged there. I pulled the net up manually, hand over hand, moving slowly because my brain needed time to process what I was looking at. When I got it close enough to the surface, I could see clearly. I thought of it as she immediately, though I couldn't tell you why, had arms and a torso and a head that were distinctly humanoid. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in places, with a faint pattern of scales that caught the light along her shoulders and down her sides. Her hands were tangled in the mesh, and I could see webbing between the fingers, thin membranes that looked delicate enough to tear. Her face was the part that made my chest tighten. It wasn't a fish face. The structure was human enough that Ma recognized expressions, fear primarily, but also something calculating, like she was assessing me while I assessed her. Her eyes were larger than human eyes, positioned slightly more to the sides of her head, and they were a color I'd never seen before, something between gray and green with an internal luminescence that might have been reflecting the dawn light or might have been coming from within. Below her waist, her body transitioned into something fish-like. Not a tail exactly, but a continuation of her torso that narrowed and ended in a horizontal fluke, similar to a dolphin's but more elaborate, with what looked like translucent fins extending from the edges. The whole structure was caught in the netting, wrapped around her midsection and lower body in a way that looked painful even though she'd stopped struggling. I stood there holding the gaff with the net suspended beside my boat, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind went through possibilities. Automatically, some kind of seal I didn't recognize, a deformed fish, a person in a costume, but none of those explanations fit what was directly in front of me. The longer I looked, the more details I noticed that didn't match anything I'd encountered in 10 years of fishing these waters. She made a sound. It wasn't speech, but it wasn't an animal noise either. It was a series of clicks, and what I can only describe as chirps, modulated in a way that sounded intentional, like language I couldn't understand. While she made these sounds, she kept her eyes fixed on mine, and I had the distinct impression she was trying to communicate something specific. I realized I'd been holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. My hands were shaking slightly, though whether from adrenaline or fear or something else, I couldn't say. The practical part of my brain started working again. Whatever she was caught in my net and clearly alive, and I needed to make a decision about what to do next. The first thing I did was secure the net to the side cleat so I could use both hands. I'd caught dolphins before, and once a small whale calf that had somehow wrapped itself in one of my set lines. The procedure was always the same: work quickly, cut carefully, minimize contact, get the animal back in the water as fast as possible. But as I reached for my knife, I realized this situation was different in ways that made my standard approach seem inadequate. She watched me reach for the blade. Her eyes tracked the movement of my hand to my belt, and when I pulled the knife free, she went completely still. Not the frozen stillness of prey confronting a predator, but something more controlled, like she was choosing not to move. That moment of recognition, that she understood what the knife was and what I might do with it, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. I moved slowly, narrating my actions out loud, even though I knew she couldn't understand. English! "I'm going to cut the net," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to get you free." The words were more for my benefit than hers, a way to maintain some sense of normalcy while doing something that felt anything but normal. The netting was commercial-grade monofilament, designed to be strong enough to hold several 100 pounds of fish. It had wrapped around her in layers, with the worst tangles concentrated around her waist and the upper part of her tail section. I started at the edges, cutting away the outer loops first. Each time I brought the knife close to her skin, she tensed, but didn't pull away. Her cooperation was unnerving because it implied understanding, and understanding implied an intelligence I wasn't prepared to acknowledge. Her skin felt wrong under my fingers when I had to touch it to pull sections of net away. It wasn't slimy the way fish skin is, but it wasn't dry either. There was a texture to it, almost like very fine suede with an underlying firmness that suggested muscle structure beneath. The scales I'd noticed earlier were concentrated along her sides and shoulders, each one slightly overlapping the next in a pattern that looked deliberately arranged rather than random. I worked for about 10 minutes, cutting carefully to avoid nicking her with the blade. She made those clicking sounds periodically, varying the rhythm and pitch in ways that seemed responsive to what I was doing. When I cut away a particularly tight section that must have been causing pain, the clicks came faster and higher. When I paused to reposition the net, they slowed to a kind of low thrumming that I felt as much as heard. The webbing between her fingers was the most delicate part of her anatomy that I could see. It looked like living tissue, translucent enough that I could see what looked like vein structures running through it in fine branching patterns. One section of her left hand had a small tear where the net had caught, and there was a faint discoloration around the wound that might have been blood or might have been something else. I made a mental note that she could be injured, and to work even more carefully. When I got to the netting around her tail section, I had to lean further over the gunnel. She shifted position to help, rotating her upper body in a way that gave me better access to the tangles. The cooperation was unmistakable now. She was actively assisting in her own rescue, holding certain sections of netting away from her body so I could cut underneath them, staying motionless when I worked near areas where a sudden movement might result in injury. The sun had fully risen by the time I cut through the last section of netting. The whole process had taken maybe 20 minutes, though it felt longer. I pulled the damaged net into the boat and looked down at her. She was still holding onto the side of the net with one hand, suspended in the water beside my boat, and we both seemed uncertain about what should happen next. I'd expected her to simply swim away once she was free, but she stayed there watching me with those oversized eyes. I could see now that her pupils were horizontal, like a goat's or an octopus's, and they contracted and expanded slightly as she looked from me to the knife in my hand to the pile of cut netting on my deck. She was studying me as intently as I was studying her. "You're free," I said, knowing it was absurd to speak to her but needing to fill the silence somehow. "You can go now." I made a gesture with my hand, a sort of shooing motion toward the open water, and immediately felt stupid for doing it. She clicked once, a single sharp sound, then released her grip on the net, but instead of swimming away immediately, she dove down about 10 feet and then surfaced again, this time about 20 feet from the boat. She stayed there, her head and shoulders above water, looking back at me. I noticed for the first time that she had something that could be called hair, though it was more like very fine filaments that moved independently in the water, creating a kind of halo effect around her head. The color shifted depending on the angle of the light, ranging from dark green to almost silver. I raised one hand in what I intended as a farewell gesture. She seemed to register the movement, tilting her head slightly to one side in a motion that was disturbingly human. Then she made a more complex series of sounds, clicks, chirps, and something that almost sounded like a whistle, before diving forward and disappearing beneath the surface. The water where she'd been barely rippled. I stood at the gunwale for another 5 minutes, watching the spot where she'd vanished, half expecting her to surface again. The water remained empty except for the usual morning movements of waves and current. A pair of gulls landed on the bow of my boat, looking for scraps, and their presence broke whatever spell I'd been under. Looked down at the ruined net on my deck, then at my hands, which had stopped shaking but still felt strange, like they remembered touching something they shouldn't have been able to touch. I started the engine and brought in the rest of my gear mechanically, not really paying attention to what I was doing. The remaining nets held fish, and I processed them automatically, sorting by species and size, throwing back anything underweight, packing the keepers in ice. My hands knew the work well enough that my mind could wander, and it wandered repeatedly back to those 20 minutes of cutting her free. The details wouldn't settle into a coherent memory. Every time I tried to picture her clearly, the image felt more like something I dreamed than something I'd actually seen. But my knife was still damp, and the cut netting was still piled on my deck, and my shirt had watermarks where I'd leaned over the gunwale. The physical evidence insisted that something had happened, even if my brain struggled to accept what that something was. I headed back to harbor around 9, 3 hours earlier than usual. The other fishermen who worked out of Crescent Harbor would notice the early return, and some of them would ask if I'd had engine trouble or bad luck with the nets. I spent the trip back deciding what I would tell them, eventually settling on a vague story about damaged gear that needed repair. It wasn't exactly a lie. I didn't call anyone. That decision happened in the moment, but felt like it had weight that would extend far beyond the immediate situation. When I docked at Crescent Harbor and started unloading my catch, I had my phone in my pocket, and there were at least a dozen people I could have contacted. The harbor master would have been the obvious choice, or maybe the Coast Guard, or even the University Marine Biology Department about 60 miles south. But I didn't reach for the phone, and with each hour that passed, The idea of making that call felt increasingly impossible. The problem was that I couldn't imagine any version of reporting what I'd seen that didn't end badly. If I told someone I'd found a mermaid in my nets, I'd be met with either disbelief or a level of attention that would fundamentally change my life. The disbelief bothered me less than the attention. I kept imagining boats full of researchers descending on my fishing grounds, or worse, boats full of people who wanted to capture and study what I'd released. The thought of her tangled in nets again, this time deliberately, made my stomach turn. By the time I finished selling my catch to the processor, a smaller haul than usual, which they noted but didn't question, I'd mentally committed to keeping what happened to myself. The decision brought a sense of relief mixed with isolation. I now possessed knowledge that I couldn't share, and that knowledge felt both precious and burdensome in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I spent the afternoon repairing the damaged net. The work was meditative, requiring enough attention that I couldn't think too deeply about anything else while I was doing it. I sat on the deck of my boat with the net spread out around me, methodically cutting away the ruined sections and splicing in new material. Other fishermen passed by occasionally, and a few stopped to chat. Tom Hendricks asked about my morning, and I told him I'd snagged something heavy that tore up one of my nets. He commiserated and shared a story about losing an entire set line to what he suspected was a shark. The conversation was normal and familiar, and I felt like I was performing my part in a play where I was the only one who knew the script had changed. That evening, I drove to the grocery store and bought supplies for the week ahead. I walked down aisles I'd walked down hundreds of times, putting items in my cart with the same automatic selection process I always used. Pasta, canned sauce, coffee, bread, eggs, frozen vegetables. The fluorescent lights were too bright, and the background music was some pop song I didn't recognize. Everything felt aggressively mundane, and I found myself studying the other shoppers, wondering what impossible things they might have experienced that they'd chosen not to share. At home, I made dinner and ate it while watching television, though I couldn't have told you what program was on. My house was a small two-bedroom rental about a mile from the harbor, furnished with furniture left by previous tenants and my own minimal additions. I'd lived there for 6 years and never bothered to make it feel particularly personal. It was a place to sleep and eat between trips on the water, nothing more. I tried to read before bed, a paperback mystery I'd been working through for the past 2 weeks, but I couldn't focus on the words. My mind kept reconstructing the morning in detail, the feeling of the net in my hands, the sound of her clicking, the way she'd watched me with obvious intelligence. I kept returning to the moment when she'd stayed after being freed, studying me instead of immediately fleeing. That behavior suggested something more than animal instinct. She'd made a choice to linger, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of something else. Sleep came eventually, though my dreams were fragmented and strange. I was back on the boat, but the water was the wrong color, too dark and somehow thick. The nets kept getting tangled no matter how carefully I set them, and there was a sense of being watched from below that made the dream atmosphere tense and uncomfortable. I woke up around 3 a.m, briefly disoriented, before remembering where I was and why I felt unsettled. The next day was Wednesday. I had originally planned to go back out, but when I got to the harbor just after dawn, I found myself hesitating. My boat was fueled and ready, the repaired nets were properly stored, and the weather forecast was favorable. There was no logical reason not to work, but the thought of going back to that inlet, of setting nets in the same waters where I'd found her, created a resistance I couldn't quite overcome. I told myself I was being irrational. The ocean was vast, and the likelihood of any kind of repeat encounter was effectively zero. Whatever she was, wherever she'd gone, it had nothing to do with my fishing schedule, but the rationalization didn't help. I spent an hour doing unnecessary maintenance on my boat, checking equipment that didn't need checking, before finally admitting to myself that I wasn't going out that day. Instead, I drove to the public library in the larger town about 30 miles away. Crescent Harbor's library was tiny, just one room in the community center with maybe 1,000 books, but the regional library was more substantial. I didn't have a specific research plan, but I felt compelled to look for something, some reference or documentation that might help me understand what I'd experienced. I started with marine biology, textbooks, paging through sections on unusual species and rare sightings. There were fish with unexpected features, deep-sea creatures with bioluminescence and strange body structures, mammals adapted to aquatic life in ways that seemed almost alien. But nothing matched what I'd seen. I moved to mythology and folklore, finding countless cultures with stories of merfolk and water spirits. The illustrations varied wildly in their depictions, some showing creatures that were more fish than human, others showing essentially humans with tails attached. None of them captured the specific reality of what had been tangled in my net. I spent 4 hours in that library, leaving only when it closed in the late afternoon. I'd taken notes on a few passages that seemed potentially relevant. Accounts of sailors reporting unusual sightings, indigenous stories about sea people from Pacific Northwest tribes, a marine biologist's memoir that included a chapter on unexplained phenomena. But none of it felt satisfying. I'd gone looking for confirmation or explanation, and instead, I'd found only stories and speculation. On the drive back to Crescent Harbor, I made a decision that felt significant, even though it was purely internal. I wasn't going to try to solve the mystery. I wasn't going to become obsessed with researching or seeking out more information. I was going to acknowledge that I'd experienced something extraordinary, accept that I might never fully understand it, and then return to my normal life as much as possible. The decision brought a sense of calm that had been absent since Tuesday morning. That night, I actually slept through until my alarm. When I woke Thursday morning, I made coffee and got dressed and headed to the harbor with the intention of working. The sky was overcast and the forecast called for possible rain in the afternoon, but the seas would be manageable. I loaded my gear and checked my equipment and started the engine. Everything felt routine again, or close enough to routine that I could function. I decided to fish a different area that day, not out of fear, but out of what I recognized as respect. The inlet where I'd found her felt like it should be left alone, at least for a while. There were plenty of other productive spots along the coast, and I knew the waters well enough to adapt my strategy. I headed south instead of west, toward a series of underwater plateaus where I'd had good luck in previous years. The day passed uneventfully. I set my nets, brought them in, processed the catch, headed back to harbor. The work was familiar and grounding, requiring physical effort and attention to detail in ways that kept my mind occupied. By the time I sold my catch and cleaned my boat, I felt more like myself than I had in 2 days. But that night, everything changed again. I want to be clear about the timeline because it matters for understanding what happened next. I found her in my nets on Tuesday morning. I spent Wednesday in the library and Thursday fishing a different area. Thursday night I slept poorly, but not unusually so, and Friday I went out again, working the same southern grounds I'd fished the day before. The routine was helping. I was starting to believe I could file the experience away as a strange anomaly, something that had happened once and wouldn't affect my life beyond the immediate memory of it. Friday evening I stayed later than usual at the harbor, helping another fisherman repair a hydraulic line on his winch. By the time I finished and cleaned up, it was nearly 8 o'clock and the sun was setting. Most of the other boats had already left for the day. I remember the quality of the light during that particular sunset. The sky was clear after days of clouds, and everything had an orange-gold cast that made even the industrial parts of the harbor look almost beautiful. I drove home, made dinner, watched part of a baseball game on television. The normalcy felt earned somehow, like I'd successfully navigated my way through a disorienting experience, and emerged intact on the other side. I went to bed around 11, tired in the good way that comes from physical work and ready for sleep. The distinction between Friday and Saturday matters because I want to emphasize that nothing about Friday suggested what Saturday would bring. There were no signs, no premonitions, no sense of building tension. Friday was simply a normal day in a life that had returned to its normal patterns. Saturday morning, I woke at my usual time and went through my usual routine. Coffee, weather check, drive to the harbor. The forecast looked excellent. Clear skies, light winds, calm seas. I decided to return to the western grounds, including the inlet where I'd found her. Enough time had passed that the decision felt reasonable rather than anxious. I would fish my most productive spots and not avoid areas based on an encounter that, however strange, was clearly a one-time occurrence. I reached the inlet around 6:30, just as the sun was clearing the horizon. The water was flat and dark, reflecting the early morning sky like polished glass. I set my first net in almost exactly the same location where I'd been the previous Tuesday. There was a moment of hesitation as I watched the net sink, but it passed quickly. I moved to my second position, set that net, then my third. The whole process took about 40 minutes, which was standard. I spent the next 2 hours drifting and monitoring the weather, drinking coffee from a thermos, and watching seabirds work the water. A group of pelicans was diving repeatedly about 100 yards from my boat, which suggested a school of baitfish near the surface. The morning was peaceful in the way that early hours on the ocean can be, with the sense of space and solitude that I'd always found centering. When I started pulling nets around 9 o'clock, I was thinking about whether to make a second set or head in early, depending on the size of the catch. The first net came up clean, holding maybe 50 pounds of mixed species. I processed them quickly, working through the familiar motions of sorting and packing. The second net was similar, slightly lighter, but still respectable for the time of year. The third net, the one set closest to where I'd found her, came up completely empty. Not just light, but actually empty except for a few small rockfish that I threw back immediately. I checked the net carefully for damage, thinking maybe it had torn and lost its catch, but the mesh was intact. I'd simply dropped it in a spot where there happened to be no fish, which was unusual but not unprecedented. I reset all 3 nets in slightly different positions and decided to make one more pull before heading in. The morning had warmed considerably, and I shed my jacket, working in just a t-shirt and my waterproof overalls. The ocean remained calm, with just enough breeze to keep the air from feeling stagnant. I ate a sandwich and checked my phone, seeing a text from Tom Hendricks asking if I wanted to grab dinner that evening. I replied that I'd let him know after I finished working. The second pull was better. All 3 nets held decent amounts of fish, including several large cod that would command good prices. I was processing the catch from the third net when I noticed the smell. It's hard to describe exactly, but it was something like salt and kelp and something else, something organic but not quite living. The closest comparison I can make is to the smell of the beach at low tide, but concentrated and somehow cleaner. I looked around, trying to locate the source, and saw nothing unusual. The smell faded after a few seconds, and I went back to work, finishing with the fish and storing the gear. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon by that point, and I decided to head back to harbor. I'd had a productive enough day to make the fuel costs worthwhile, and I was already thinking about whether to meet Tom for dinner or spend the evening at home. The trip back took about 45 minutes. I monitored the radio, listening to other fishermen reporting their positions and catches, and watched the coastline gradually come into clearer definition as I approached Crescent Harbor. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. I docked around 3, secured my boat, and started the unloading process. The processor's truck was already there, and I helped transfer my catch, receiving a decent payment that I deposited using my phone. Other fishermen were coming and going, and I exchanged brief conversations with several of them. Someone mentioned seeing dolphins near the northern rocks. Someone else complained about equipment costs. The conversations were familiar and unremarkable. I finished cleaning my boat around 4:30 and stood on the dock, looking back out at the ocean. The water had picked up some light chop during the afternoon, and the sun was beginning its descent toward evening, though sunset wouldn't come for another few hours. I had no particular reason to linger, but I found myself reluctant to leave, though I couldn't have explained why. Tom Hendricks called instead of texting, asking again about dinner. I agreed, and we decided to meet at the Harbor Grill at 6. I had enough time to go home, shower, and change clothes, so I left the dock and drove back to my rental house. The shower was hot and long, and I spent the time trying not to think too hard about the empty net, or the strange smell, or the vague sense of unease that had been growing throughout the afternoon despite the day's overall success. I met Tom at the restaurant exactly at 6. The Harbor Grill was the closest thing Crescent Harbor had to a nice establishment. It wasn't fancy, but it had tablecloths and a menu that extended beyond fried food. We got a table by the window overlooking the harbor, and I ordered fish, which Tom found amusing since I spent all day around fish. The irony wasn't lost on me either, but I'd never gotten tired of eating what I caught. We talked about fishing, about equipment, about the upcoming storm season. Tom mentioned he was thinking about upgrading his boat, possibly adding another crew member to increase his range and capacity. I listened and contributed to the conversation, but part of my attention kept drifting to the window and the view of the harbor. The boats bobbed gently at their moorings, and the water reflected the pink and orange light of the approaching sunset. Tom noticed my distraction and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was just tired, which was true enough. He accepted the explanation and shifted the conversation to other topics: local politics, a mutual friend's upcoming wedding, speculation about whether the processor would raise their rates next season. The meal was good, and the company was comfortable, and by the time we finished around 7:30, I felt more present and less unsettled. We parted ways in the parking lot, and I drove home as the last light was fading from the sky. At home, I changed into more comfortable clothes and tried to decide what to do with the rest of the evening. I wasn't particularly tired, despite Tom's observation. I felt restless, energized in a way that didn't match my physical state after a full day of work. I decided to go for a walk, something I did occasionally when I needed to think or burn off excess energy. My house was close enough to the beach that I could reach it in about 10 minutes on foot. I grabbed a jacket and a flashlight and headed out into the growing darkness. The beach I walked to wasn't part of the harbor area. It was a public access point about a mile down the coast, a stretch of rocky sand that saw minimal use outside of summer tourist season. At this time of year and this time of night, I expected to have it to myself. And I was right. The parking area was empty, and the only sounds were waves and distant traffic from the main road. I walked down to the waterline where the sand was wet and packed firm. The tide was coming in, and each wave pushed a little further up the beach before retreating. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light that I barely needed the flashlight. I walked south along the water's edge, not thinking about anything in particular, just moving and breathing the salt air and letting the sound of the waves fill my head. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I decided to head back. I turned around and started retracing my path, and that's when I noticed I wasn't alone. I need to correct something about the timing. When I said I noticed I wasn't alone during my evening walk, that's not exactly accurate. The walk itself was uneventful. I did walk for 20 minutes, and I did turn around and head back, and I did make it home without incident. What happened came later, much later, after I'd returned to my house and eventually gone to bed. I'm making this correction because the sequence of events matters, and I don't want to create confusion about when things actually occurred. The walk was on Saturday evening. What I'm about to describe happened in the early hours of Sunday morning. I got back from my walk around 9:30 and spent another hour at home, reading and drinking tea. I went to bed around 11, which was slightly later than my usual schedule, but not dramatically so. I fell asleep relatively quickly, tired from the physical work of the day and the long walk on the beach. I don't remember what I was dreaming about when I woke up. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was abrupt, the kind where you're immediately alert rather than gradually surfacing. My first thought was that I'd heard something, a noise from outside or from elsewhere in the house, but when I lay there listening, everything was silent. I checked my phone. It was 12:43 in the morning. I'd been asleep for less than 2 hours, and I felt completely awake in a way that suggested getting back to sleep would be difficult. I closed my eyes and tried anyway, but after 10 minutes of lying there, I accepted that sleep wasn't coming immediately back. I got up, went to the bathroom, then went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. The house was dark except for the blue glow of the digital clock on the microwave. I stood at the sink, drinking the water, and looking out the window at nothing in particular. My house didn't have much of a view. The kitchen window faced the side yard and the neighbor's fence, but I found myself staring out anyway, the way you do when you're awake at odd hours and your mind is wandering. That's when I heard it the first time. The sound came from outside but felt close enough that it seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was low frequency, below the range of normal hearing, but somehow audible anyway. I felt it in my chest and stomach before I consciously registered it as sound. The closest comparison I can make is to standing near a large speaker playing bass notes, but this was more organic, less mechanical. I set down my water glass and stood very still, listening. The sound came again, slightly different in tone, but with the same physical quality of being felt as much as heard. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. I waited, but it didn't repeat. I told myself it was a boat engine somewhere in the harbor, even though I knew that didn't make sense. Boat engines don't sound like that, and I was too far from the harbor for engine noise to reach my house with that kind of intensity. But I needed an explanation, and that was the one I grabbed onto initially. I went back to bed and lay there for another 20 minutes, listening to nothing but silence. Eventually, I drifted back toward sleep, not fully asleep, but in that transitional state where thoughts become loose and disconnected. The sound came again, and this time it pulled me completely awake. I sat up, certain now that what I was hearing wasn't mechanical. The sound had variation in it, modulation that seemed intentional. It would rise slightly in pitch, hold, then drop again before fading out. And it was closer than before, or at least louder, which made me think whatever was producing it had moved. I got out of bed again and went to the living room window, which faced toward the coast. I couldn't see the ocean from my house. There were other buildings and trees blocking the view, but the sound was definitely coming from that direction. I stood at the window for several minutes, watching and listening. The neighborhood was dark and still. No lights on in nearby houses, no cars passing on the street, no visible movement anywhere. The sound came a third time, and I made a decision that I knew was probably irrational but felt necessary. I got dressed, pulled on shoes and a jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and went outside. The night air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of salt water. I stood on my front step, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, and listening. Everything was quiet. I felt foolish standing there in the middle of the night, but I also felt compelled to investigate, to find some explanation for what I was hearing that would let me go back to bed and sleep. I started walking toward the beach. The streets were empty, and my footsteps sounded loud in the silence. I passed darkened houses and parked cars and a closed convenience store. The walk took about 8 minutes, slightly less than usual, because I was moving faster than normal, driven by a combination of curiosity and something else, something like anxiety, but not quite. The public beach parking area was empty, as expected. I walked down the path to the sand and stopped at the top of the beach, looking out at the ocean. The moon was still up, casting silver light across the water. The tide was high, much higher than it had been during my earlier walk, and the waves were breaking close to where the sand met the rocks at the edge of the parking area. I stood there scanning the water, using my flashlight to sweep across the surface, looking for boats or large marine animals or anything that might explain the sound. I saw nothing unusual, just waves and moonlight and the dark mass of the ocean extending to the horizon. I was about to give up and head home when the sound came again, and this time I could tell it was coming from directly offshore, maybe 100 yards out. It was louder here than it had been at my house, loud enough that I felt it resonate in my bones. The sound held for longer than before, maybe 5 seconds, and in the middle of it, I thought I heard variation. Different tones layered over each other like a chord rather than a single note. I turned off my flashlight and waited, watching the water. My eyes had adjusted fully to the darkness, and I could see relatively well in the moonlight. The waves rose and fell in their regular rhythm. Nothing broke the surface. Nothing moved except the water itself. Then I saw her. She rose vertically from the ocean about 70 yards from shore, emerging slowly like she was being lifted from below. The water streamed off her body, catching the moonlight, and I could see her clearly despite the distance. She was massive, at least 12 feet tall, maybe more, with the same general body structure as the child I'd freed from my nets, but scaled up proportionally. Her shoulders were broad, her arms long, her torso powerful. Below her waist, her tail extended down into the water, and I couldn't see where it ended. She stayed there, suspended half in and half out of the water, completely motionless. She was facing the shore, facing me specifically, though I couldn't tell if she could see me or if she was simply oriented toward the beach in general. The distance was too great to make out details of her face, but I could see the shape of her head, the fall of those hair-like filaments around her shoulders, the slight movement of her arms as they hung at her sides. I stood frozen, not breathing, not thinking, just processing the impossibility of what I was seeing. She stayed visible for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Then she made the sound again, and this time I could see it was coming from her, though I couldn't tell what part of her anatomy was producing it. The sound resonated across the water and through my body, and even though I didn't understand it, I felt with absolute certainty that it was meant for me. Then she sank back into the ocean, descending as slowly and deliberately as she'd risen until the water closed over her head and she was gone. I didn't move for a long time after she disappeared. My feet were planted in the sand, and my body felt locked in place, like moving would somehow break whatever had just happened and make it less real. The ocean continued its normal rhythm, waves rolling in and pulling back, completely indifferent to what had just occurred. I kept staring at the spot where she'd been, half expecting her to rise again, but the water remained empty. Eventually, my practical mind started working again. I checked my phone, 1:17 in the morning. I'd been standing there for about 10 minutes since she'd vanished, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. My hands were shaking slightly, and I realized I was cold, though I couldn't tell if that was from the night air or from shock. I needed to process what had happened, but my thoughts wouldn't organize themselves into anything coherent. She had come here. She had found me, specifically me, at a beach a mile from my house in the middle of the night. The impossibility of that should have made me question whether I'd actually seen anything at all, but I knew I was awake. I knew what I'd witnessed was real, in the same way I'd known the child in my nets had been real. I walked down to the waterline, where the waves were pushing foam and small debris up onto the sand. I stood there looking out at the dark water, trying to understand what her appearance meant. She had risen from the ocean and faced the shore for those 20 seconds, making that sound that I now understood was deliberate communication. She was telling me something, or showing me something, though I had no idea what. The correlation was obvious. I'd freed the child on Tuesday. This was her, the mother, I assumed, based on size and similarity of features. She'd come here because of what I'd done, but I didn't know if this was gratitude or warning or something else entirely. Her behavior hadn't been threatening. She'd simply appeared, made herself visible, produced that sound, and then left. The whole encounter had the feeling of a message being delivered, though I couldn't read the message. I stayed on the beach for another 30 minutes, walking along the waterline and occasionally stopping to look out at the ocean. She didn't reappear. The only sounds were waves and wind and the occasional cry of a night bird. Eventually, I accepted that nothing more was going to happen and started the walk back home. The streets were still empty. I passed the same darkened houses and parked cars, but everything felt different now, charged with significance I couldn't name. When I got home, I stood in my kitchen with the lights off, drinking water and trying to calm my racing thoughts. Sleep seemed impossible, but I went to bed anyway, lying in the darkness and replaying the encounter in my mind over and over. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke to sunlight coming through my bedroom window. My phone showed 8:43, much later than I usually slept. I felt groggy and disoriented, and for a few seconds I wondered if the entire night had been a dream. But my shoes were by the door where I'd left them after coming in from the beach, and they were sandy. I'd been there. I'd seen her. Sunday passed in a strange fog. I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes before my thoughts would circle back to the beach, to her rising from the water, to that sound. I tried to maintain my normal routine, breakfast, coffee, reading the news on my phone, but everything felt performative. I was going through the motions of a regular day while my mind processed something far outside the boundaries of regular experience. Around noon, I drove back to the beach. In daylight, it looked completely ordinary. A few other people were there, walking dogs or jogging, and their presence made the previous night feel even more surreal. I walked to approximately where I'd been standing and looked out at the water. A man throwing a tennis ball for his dog glanced at me, probably wondering why I was standing motionless staring at the ocean, and I forced myself to start walking to seem less strange. I spent the afternoon trying to research, going back to the library and pulling the same books I'd looked at before. I was searching for stories of contact, of communication, of what happened after encounters with something impossible. Most of what I found was either mythology or obvious fiction. The few accounts that seemed potentially genuine were frustratingly vague, offering no guidance for my specific situation. That night, I couldn't decide whether to go to the beach again. Part of me wanted to be there in case she returned. Part of me was afraid of what it would mean if she did. I compromised by staying home but sleeping fitfully, waking several times throughout the night and listening for that sound. It never came. Monday morning, I went fishing. The decision felt important, like I was choosing to continue my normal life despite everything that had changed. I worked the southern grounds again, avoiding the inlet, and had a decent day. The physical work helped ground me, gave me something concrete to focus on besides the questions spinning through my mind. But Monday night, the sound came again. I was already in bed around midnight when I felt more than heard that low vibration. This time, I didn't hesitate. I got dressed immediately and headed to the beach, moving quickly through the empty streets. When I reached the sand, she was already there, visible in the moonlight about 80 yards offshore. She was in the same position as before, upper body above water, motionless, facing the shore. I walked down to the waterline and stopped. We stayed like that for maybe a minute, separated by dark water, looking at each other across the distance. Then she moved, lifting one arm slowly and extending it forward, palm up. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, and I found myself raising my own hand in response, mirroring her movement without thinking about it. She held the position for several seconds, then lowered her arm. She made a sound different from the deep vibration I'd heard before. This was higher, more varied, with a musical quality. That reminded me of whale song, but more complex. The sound lasted about 10 seconds, rising and falling in patterns that felt like they should mean something. When the sound ended, she remained there, and I had the sense she was waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't respond in any meaningful way. I couldn't produce sounds like hers, and I had no idea if she could understand speech or gesture. So I just stood there feeling helpless and frustrated by the barrier between us. Then I remembered something. I walked back up the beach to where I'd left my jacket and pulled out my phone. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the water, clicking it on and off 3 times. It was a simple signal, basic communication, but it was something. She responded immediately. She dove forward into a shallow dive, her tail breaking the surface as she went under, and I saw it fully for the first time, broad and powerful, with flowing translucent fins that caught the moonlight. She surfaced about 20 yards closer, near enough now that I could see her face more clearly. She was watching me intently, and I clicked the flashlight 3 more times. She made a shorter sound, just 2 or 3 seconds, then dove again. This time when she surfaced, she was only about 30 feet from shore, close enough that I could see details I'd missed before. Her skin had a faint luminescence to it, barely visible but definitely present. Her eyes were large and dark, reflecting my flashlight when I pointed it near her. Her face had a structure that was both human and not, familiar enough to read expression, but different enough to make those expressions slightly alien. She stayed at that distance, and over the next 10 minutes, we established a basic exchange. I would flash my light in patterns, 1 flash, 2 flashes, 3 flashes, and she would respond with sounds of varying length and pitch. I had no idea if we were actually communicating anything meaningful, but the attempt itself felt significant. She was trying, and I was trying, and that mutual effort created a connection that transcended actual understanding. Eventually, she made a longer, more complex sound, then sank beneath the surface and didn't reappear. I waited for 20 minutes, but she was gone. I walked home feeling something I hadn't felt since this all started. Not confusion or fear or wonder, but something closer to hope. She came back Tuesday night and Wednesday night and Thursday night. Each time I met her at the beach, and each time we continued our strange attempts at communication. By the 4th night, I'd started bringing a notebook, writing down the patterns of her sounds and trying to find correlations between my light signals and her responses. I had no training in linguistics or animal communication, but I was learning through repetition. I noticed she seemed to understand pointing. When I would shine my flashlight at something, a rock, the water, the sky, and then flash a pattern, her responding sounds would vary based on what I'd indicated. This suggested she was reading my gestures as meaningful, which implied a level of intelligence that made my chest tight with the implications. On Friday night, something different happened. She arrived earlier than usual, while there was still some twilight in the sky, and she came closer to shore than she ever had before, near enough that the waves were breaking around her. She had something in her hand. She held it up, showing it to me clearly, then set it carefully on the surface of the water. It floated, which surprised me, until I realized it must be naturally buoyant. She gestured toward it, a clear indication that she wanted me to take it, then moved back slightly, giving me space to approach. I waded into the water up to my knees, which was as deep as I was willing to go in jeans and boots. The object was drifting slowly toward shore on the incoming tide, and I reached out and grabbed it when it came within arm's length. It was a shell, but unlike any shell I'd seen in these waters. It was roughly the size of my fist, spiral in structure, with a smooth surface that felt almost like polished stone. The color shifted depending on how the light hit it, ranging from deep blue to pale green to something almost silver. I held it up, examining it, then looked back at her. She was watching me with obvious attention, and when I held the shell up higher, acknowledging that I'd received it, she made a sound that I'd come to recognize as something like satisfaction or approval. The tone was warm, if that word can apply to the sound she made. I stood there in the shallows holding the shell, and she stayed where she was, and for maybe 30 seconds we just looked at each other. I wanted to say something, to express gratitude or acknowledgement, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, I placed my hand over my heart, a gesture I hoped was universal enough to communicate something like, "Thank you," or "I understand." She mimicked the gesture, placing her own hand, webbed fingers spread wide, over her chest. Then she made one more sound, longer and more elaborate than anything she'd produced before, with layers of different tones that seemed to overlap and harmonize. When it ended, she dove and disappeared, and somehow I knew she wouldn't be coming back that night. I walked home carrying the shell carefully, aware that I was holding something precious and probably irreplaceable. At home, I examined it under better light. The surface had incredibly fine etching on it, patterns that might have been natural or might have been deliberately carved. The spiral structure was perfect, mathematical in its precision. The interior, when I looked inside, had a faint iridescence that caught and reflected light in unexpected ways. I set it on my dresser where I could see it from my bed. That night, I slept better than I had in over a week. The visits became less frequent after she gave me the shell. She came back Saturday night, then not again until Tuesday, then Thursday, then not for several days. Each time she appeared, we would go through our communication attempts, and each time I felt like we understood each other slightly better, though I still couldn't have translated any specific meaning from her sounds. But I started noticing other changes, things that were subtle at first but became more obvious over time. My fishing improved dramatically. I don't mean I was catching more fish. I mean I was catching exactly what I needed, consistently, without the usual variation in luck that every fisherman experiences. Some days would be better than others in terms of volume, but I never came back with less than I needed to cover my costs and make a living wage. More than that, I stopped having the small disasters that are part of working on the ocean. I didn't lose gear to snags. I didn't have equipment failures at critical moments. Twice I ran into weather that should have been dangerous, and both times the worst of it seemed to move around me, leaving my area relatively calm while nearby waters were being hammered. I caught myself thinking that I was being protected, which sounded irrational even inside my own head, but the evidence kept accumulating. A net that should have torn on an underwater obstruction came free cleanly. An engine problem that should have stranded me miles from shore resolved itself when I tried the ignition one more time. A navigation error that should have put me in shallow waters somehow resulted in me being exactly where I'd intended to go. Other fishermen noticed. Tom Hendricks commented that I seemed to have better luck than usual. Another fisherman, Sarah Chen, asked half-jokingly if I'd found some secret fishing spot I wasn't sharing. I deflected these observations with vague responses about being more careful with my equipment or having better timing with the tides. The truth was, I had no explanation that I could share. I believed the changes were connected to her, to what I'd done by freeing the child, and to what had developed between us in those meetings on the beach. But I couldn't prove it, and I wasn't about to tell anyone that I thought a sea creature was somehow watching over my fishing operation. The visits stopped completely in late October. I went to the beach several nights waiting, but she didn't appear. The sound never came through my walls. After a week of absence, I accepted that whatever phase we'd been in had ended. I felt the loss of it more than I'd expected. I'd gotten used to those encounters, to the attempt at communication, to the presence of something extraordinary in my otherwise ordinary life. But the protection, if that's what it was, continued. Through November and into December, I fished without incident. My catches remained consistent. My equipment functioned reliably. The ocean seemed almost benevolent when I was on it, which was a feeling I'd never experienced in 10 years of commercial fishing. In early December, I was working near the inlet where I'd originally found the child. I'd started fishing that area again without even thinking about it, and it had become one of my most productive spots. I was pulling my second net of the morning when I felt something tug on the line in a way that didn't match fish getting caught. I slowed the winch and looked down into the water. About 15 feet below the surface, I could see something pale holding onto the net. My first thought was that the child had gotten tangled again, and my stomach dropped. But as the net came higher, I realized it wasn't tangled. Something was deliberately holding it. The child's face broke the surface. She was bigger than she'd been in September, noticeably grown, but still clearly young. She was holding the net with one hand and using the other to keep herself steady in the water. She looked up at me, and I could have sworn she smiled, though her facial structure made human expression slightly ambiguous. She made a sound, a high chirping that I'd never heard from the mother, and then she released the net and dove. But before she disappeared, she did something I didn't expect. She breached completely, jumping clear of the water about 20 feet from my boat, her whole body visible for just a second, the powerful tail, the fins, the way she moved through air with the same grace she showed in water. Then she splashed down and was gone. I stood there staring at the empty water, realizing what had just happened. She'd come to show me she was fine. She'd grown, she was healthy, and she'd somehow found me to demonstrate that fact. It was gratitude or acknowledgement or maybe just connection. But whatever it was, it made everything that had happened feel complete in a way I hadn't known I needed. That was 3 years ago. I'm 34 now, and I still fish the same waters. I still live in the same rental house. I still work alone on my boat, maintaining the same routines I've had for years. From the outside, my life probably looks exactly the same as it did before any of this happened. But everything is different in ways that matter more than external circumstances. I move through my days with an awareness I didn't have before, a sense that the world contains more than what's visible on the surface. I look at the ocean differently now. It's not just a resource or a workplace, it's a boundary between worlds, and I'm one of the few people who knows something exists on the other side of that boundary. The shell sits on my dresser where I placed it that first night. I've never shown it to anyone. Tom came over once to watch a football game, and he saw it and asked where I'd gotten it. I told him I found it on the beach, which was technically true. He picked it up, examined it briefly, and set it back down without much interest. To him, it was just a shell. I never saw the mother again after October of that first year. I've been to the beach at midnight dozens of times, but she hasn't returned. I don't know if that means our business is concluded or if she simply moved on to other concerns. Either way, I'm grateful for what we had, however brief and strange it was. The protection, if I'm right about it being protection, has never wavered. I fish safely and successfully, year after year, with a consistency that goes beyond luck or skill. I've stopped questioning it and started simply accepting it as a reality of my life now. Something in the ocean watches over me, and in return I watch over these waters. I've become more careful about where I set my nets, more conscious of the impact my fishing has on the ecosystem. It feels like the right balance. I think about that Tuesday morning often, about finding her tangled in my nets. I replay the decision to cut her free rather than call someone, to protect her existence rather than expose it. That choice changed everything, and I've never regretted it. Some things are more important than proof or recognition or the chance to be part of something publicly significant. Some things are worth keeping private, worth protecting, even if it means carrying them alone. Last month, I found another fisherman's net that had been abandoned. still set and trapping fish that would die slowly. I spent 2 hours cutting it loose and hauling it up, even though it wasn't my responsibility, and I lost fishing time doing it. While I was working, I felt like I was being watched from below, though I never saw anything. When I finished and threw the last section of net into my boat to dispose of properly, I thought I heard a sound, very faint, that reminded me of her. It might have been my imagination. It might have been wishful thinking, but I chose to believe it was real. I'm more careful now about what I take from the ocean and what I leave behind. I pay attention to things I would have ignored before. Changes in currents, unusual gatherings of fish, places where the water seems somehow different. I've become a better fisherman, not because I've learned new techniques, but because I've learned to listen. The child would be older now, maybe approaching whatever passes for adolescence in her species. I wonder if she remembers me, if she told others of her kind about the human who freed her. I wonder if the mother still thinks about those nights on the beach, if our attempts at communication meant as much to her as they did to me. I carry the shell with me sometimes, wrapped in cloth and tucked into my jacket pocket when I'm on the boat. It feels like a talisman, a reminder of what exists beneath the surface. On difficult days, when the weather is rough or the fishing is slow, or I'm questioning why I do this work, I touch it and remember that I'm part of something larger than my daily routines. People ask me sometimes if I ever think about quitting, about moving inland and finding different work. I tell them I can't imagine doing anything else, which is true but incomplete. The complete truth is that I'm bound to these waters now by something more than economics or habit. I made a choice 3 years ago, and that choice created an obligation that I'll carry for the rest of my life. I still go to the beach at night occasionally, always hoping I'll see her rise from the water one more time. She never does. The ocean keeps its mysteries, and I'm content to let it. I had my moment of contact with something impossible, and that moment was enough to change how I see everything. I'm a fisherman working alone on a single boat, living in a small rental house in a small coastal town. But I know something most people don't know. I've touched something most people will never touch. I've communicated across a gap that shouldn't be crossable, and I've been given a gift that I'll protect and honor until I'm no longer able to work these waters. The ocean holds more than fish and water and salt. It holds beings of intelligence and intention, creatures that remember kindness and return it in their own ways. I know this because I've experienced it directly, and that knowledge, private and unprovable as it is, has made my life immeasurably richer than it was before. I'll keep fishing. I'll keep watching the water. And I'll keep the secret of what I found and what found me, protecting it the same way it protects me.